Hi there, my name is Dr. Buckley, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this video where we'll be chatting about short-term memory. So on September 30th, 2018, 14-year-old Tamahiro Asada from Japan won the 8th mental calculation World Cup of his career by scoring highest in a competition that included adding 10-digit numbers in 7 minutes, multiplying two 8-digit numbers in 10 minutes, identifying the day of the week from a random date in 1 minute, computing the square root of a 6-digit number in 10 minutes, as well as 5 surprise tasks that involved mental calculations. So mental calculations, like the ones performed by Tamahiro Sada, rely on something known as working memory. So what we're going to be talking about in this particular video is short-term memory. So let me distinguish for you the differences between short-term and working memory. So short-term memory only refers to the retention of material for a brief period of time. So for example, if you kept the numbers 4562 and 804 in your memory for 20 seconds, you would be using short-term memory. In contrast, the term working memory is used when a person is manipulating information in some way while retaining it. So for example, if you were to multiply 4,562 by 804 using only mental arithmetic, then that would be an example of working memory. So in 1957, Dr. William Scoville and Brenda Milner published the first paper discussing Henry Molaison, or HM, who had undergone surgery to control his intractable epilepsy and had subsequently lost his ability to form new memories. So we've already talked about HM quite a bit, but essentially, although HM could not create new long-term memories, his short-term memory appeared to be fully intact. And so, for example, he could carry on conversations and remember what happened a few seconds previously, provided he was not distracted, right? So Scoville and Milner in 1957, they argued that HM's pattern of memory loss suggested that long-term and short-term memory were different types of memory, and they were controlled by completely different mechanisms in the brain. And Scoville and Milner argued that the medial temporal lobe and the hippocampi in particular were destroyed by the surgery, and therefore they were the regions of the brain responsible for long-term memory, while other regions of the brain that were not destroyed during the surgery were responsible for short-term memory. And so as a result of that very famous paper citing this neurological dissociation between long-term memory and short-term memory, it was an impetus, right, for all kinds of different models of memory to come out. So one of the first models of short-term memory was proposed by Donald Broadbent in 1958. And so essentially, Broadbent's model is comprised of primary memory, which is short in duration, and secondary memory, which is much longer in duration. So long-term memory, short-term memory. And according to this model, information must pass through primary memory or in order to get to secondary memory. So importantly, primary memory and secondary memory are argued to comprise entirely different memory systems. So in Broadbent's model, primary memory encompasses two subsystems. The S system, which holds sensory information in a pre-categorical form before it is selected for further processing. So that's like sensory memory. And the P system, which consists of conscious thought akin to short-term memory. So material in the S system fades rapidly, and material in the P system must be rehearsed in order to be maintained, and this rehearsal may eventually lead to the information traveling to secondary memory to be available in the long term, right? So we have sensory stimulation, sensory information, information coming in through the eyes, ears, the touch receptors is temporarily registered in the S store, and then whatever we pay attention to is transferred to the P store, and if that is rehearsed, then it goes into secondary memory or long-term memory. And so um, in Broadbent's model, there was a lot of research that sort of talked about the nature of the information stored in the P store or stored in short-term memory. And it was basically posited that information in short-term memory is represented as speech or auditory information. So it's material in Broadbent's 1958 P store is maintained in a speech-like code, and several experiments supported this notion. So one very famous experiment by Conrad in 1964 compared the error rates for the recall of lists of letters that either looked alike, such as X, K, and Y, to lists of letters that looked different but sounded the same. So for example, C, V, and B, they all rhyme, right? So participants were much more likely to make errors in the sound-alike condition than the look-alike condition, which implies that verbal coding was linked to the maintenance of letters in short-term memory in the P store. Another experiment that sort of showed the same thing is that Badley, 1966, compared lists of phonologically similar words. So basically words that rhymed, like cat, hat, bat, stat, things like that, right? So phonologically similar words that rhymed were significantly worse in memory than phonologically different words. So like cat, boat, house, trigger, right? None of those words rhyme. So participants reported much higher rates of recall for phonologically distinct words that didn't rhyme than phonologically similar words that did rhyme. And in the Badley 1966 experiment, he also compared words that shared meaning and words that didn't share meaning. So words that share meaning would be like synonyms, like small, little, and tiny, as opposed to small, large, extra large, right? All those words are different. And he found that it didn't matter if the words had the same meaning or were synonyms or antonyms, they were equally recalled. So the only difference was phonologically similar words that rhymed were significantly less likely to be accurately recalled than words that didn't rhyme with each other. So ultimately, what that suggests is the way that information is represented in short-term memory is through an auditory or speech-based code. Another experiment that kind of supports that is Murray, 1968, showed that when participants were required to repeat a word while being presented with a visual list of words, participants were far less likely to falsely identify phonological words in a subsequent recognition task. So when the words were presented visually and they were less likely to confuse similar sounding words, the recall was better. So, in addition to thinking about how information is represented in terms of the memory trace in short term memory, Broadbent was also really interested in the capacity of short term memory, or how much information we can maintain in short term memory at any given time. And so the first researcher to really comment on this was George Miller. And so he published a really famous paper in 1956 called The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2. And basically, in that paper, he alleged that that uh, in short-term memory, we are capable of managing between 5 and 9 units of information. So 7 plus or minus 2, 7 minus 2 is 5, 7 plus 2 is 9. So the average capacity or amount of information we can store in short-term memory at any given time ranges from 5 units of information to 9 units of information. And he defined unit of information not as simple letters and numbers, but as what he called chunks. So for example, this sequence of letters, there are about 12 or 16 letters there, but there are actually only 4 units of information if we look at them in terms of their abbreviations, right? So if we look at them in terms of their abbreviations, we have FBI, CIA, ABC, and CBC. So because those letters are comprised of acronyms that we're all familiar with, right? It's very easy to recall them. Um, um, However, this notion of the capacity of short-term memory being 7 plus or minus 2 was discredited by Simon 1974, who found that our ability to encode units of information is highly variable. So depending on how much information is contained in each chunk, that determines how likely it is that we'll be able to recall it. And related to this, there's also a lot of evidence with methods for how you might improve the capacity of short-term memory. So a lot of times you can use a chunking strategy. So for example, there's a very famous paper by Erickson and colleagues showing that it's possible to train someone to increase their short-term memory span from about 7 items to 80 items, provided they can break those numbers into meaningful units of information. So, for example, in this paper, in this Erickson and colleagues paper, they trained a young college student to increase his number span from 7 to 80. And the strategy that he used is instead of encoding 1934, for example, he would encode 1934 as the almost the end of the Great Depression, or he would encode 4362 as a runtime. So, as a former cross country runner, he would encode that as a mile time of running a mile in 4 minutes and 32 seconds, or something like that. So by using this chunking capacity, or this chunking strategy, we can vastly increase the amount of information we can retain in short-term memory. And a lot of times, experts are able to do this. So in a very famous study by Chase and Simon, they looked at the ability of chess grandmasters versus chess novices to memorize the layout of different chess games. So they would set out the chess pieces so that they were either randomly displayed on the chessboard, kind of in a nonsensical fashion, or if they were displayed in the way they would actually be shown in a real game of chess. And they found that experts had a significant memory advantage, and they could recall the position of all the pieces from memory when they were arranged how they would be for an actual game of chess, because instead of memorizing the position of the individual pieces, they memorized groups of the pieces that were arranged in a meaningful way, right? But when the pieces were just arranged randomly in a nonsensical way, they were no better than the novices in terms of their recollection, right? So chunking is a strategy that you can utilize to increase your short-term memory capacity, and people with prior knowledge or expertise are especially well suited to do this. So one experiment that calls into question the original estimate by George Miller that people can retain between 5 and 9 units of information in their short-term memory is an experiment by Luck and Vogel in 1997. And so basically what they did is they used what's called a change detection procedure. And so basically in this procedure, you would be seated in front of a computer and you would see a screen with different colored boxes on it, right? And you would see that screen for about 100 milliseconds. So as you can see here, we have a screen with an orange box, a blue box, and a black box. And then we have a blank screen for about 900 milliseconds. And then we see the same display, except for a very subtle change, which is the black square is now green, right? And so change detection would just be the participant indicating as quickly as possible what has changed between the first display and the second display. So what we see with the change detection procedure is people are really accurate at determining what the changes are until the number of squares on the screen increases above about 4. And then at that point, the accuracy rapidly declines. So what this illustrates is that it's more accurate to say that we can only retain about 4 units of information in our short-term memory at a time. So we've talked about how memories are represented in short-term memory. They're represented as auditory traces rather than semantic or meaning-based traces, or rather than visual traces. They're auditory, right? And we know that the capacity of short-term memory, or the number of units of information we can retain, is about 4 units. So now let's talk about the duration of short-term memory, right? Or how long information can persist in short-term memory without rehearsal, right? So this is a paradigm that was kind of simultaneously discovered by Peterson and Peterson in 1959 and Brown in 1958. So collectively, we refer to it as the Brown-Peterson task. And so basically, it's a fairly simple task. So if you're a participant, basically you do a bunch of mini experiments that all follow the same format. So for example, the experimenter says CHJ 506. And your task when you hear that is to immediately start counting backwards by threes from the number 506, right? So 506, 503, 500, 497, etc. Okay? And then after a set period of counting, And in this experiment, they ranged from 3 seconds of counting all the way to 18 seconds of counting. You then have to recall the 3 letters, right? And so basically in this task, you're just repeating that procedure over and over and over again across many, many trials with different letters and different numbers to count back from. And basically what Brown and Peterson did is they took the data from all of those many experiments, all of those trials, and averaged them together. And they found that on average, after only 3 seconds of counting, the participants' recall was about 80% of the letters they saw, whereas after 18 seconds of counting, it dropped to about 10% accuracy. Okay, so keep those numbers in mind, and also keep in mind that this is an average across many different trials, right? So why do we forget in situations like that, right? So one explanation, and this is the explanation that Brown and Peterson favored, is that there's simple decay, right? So there's literally the fading of information in memory over time, right? But there's actually another explanation, and that's the interference explanation. So as we keep acquiring new memories and we're putting more information into our long-term and short-term memory stores, eventually the information starts to become disrupted, right? So some of the information in your memory gets confused or displaced with other information, right? So this is called interference, when a subset of information in your memory prevents you from remembering other sets of information. So there are 2 types of interference. There's proactive interference and retroactive interference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a definition, okay, for each type of interference. But instead of learning or memorizing the definitions, I want you to memorize the examples that I give you. Because paradoxically, if you try to memorize the definition for proactive interference and the definition for retroactive interference, you're going to confuse the two, and they're going to literally interfere with each other in your memory. Okay? So first we have proactive interference, right? So the definition for proactive interference, also known as proactive inhibition, is essentially when information that you have learned previously prevents you from learning new information. So I have a wonderful example of this that comes from a friend of mine who authored a textbook. Okay, and this example of proactive interference is calling your current significant other by your previous significant other's name. Okay, calling your current significant other by your previous significant other's name. Okay, so not only is this a terrible idea in terms of the complex dynamics of psychosocial dynamics of personal relationships, but it's also a great example, right? Because in this example, your memory for your current love interest is disrupted by all of your previous love interests, right? So that's proactive interference. An example of retroactive interference, unfortunately, is much less spicy, right? And an example of that is, for example, suppose you get a fancy new computer when you leave for college, right? So when you're a freshman in college, your parents buy you an M3 MacBook Pro, Okay, so it's very fancy smancy. It has all the bells and whistles. It has the fingerprint scanner and the retina, whatever, right? So when you're in college using your fancy new computer, you get used to all the latest technology. But when you go home for Thanksgiving, right, you forget your laptop. And so you have to use your parents' laptop, which is a MS-DOS computer, which was literally the first Apple computer ever invented, and it was considered new and fancy when I was a kid, right? Um, so this is an example of retroactive interference, right? Because having had the recent experience of using that newfangled laptop with all the latest technology, you're no longer able to remember how to use the much earlier version of a Mac computer, right? So retroactive interference occurs when new learning or more recently acquired information prevents you from remembering older information, whereas proactive interference occurs when information learned previously interferes with or impedes your ability to learn new information. So how is this relevant to the duration of short-term memory and our earlier discussion of the Brown-Peterson task? Well, it's relevant because remember that Brown and Peterson looked at the average of many, many, many trials of this procedure and found that on average, accuracy of recall for the 3-letter trigrams was better after a 3-second delay than after an 18-second delay. So it was literally on average 80% correct recall compared to 20 or less than 20%, 10% correct recall. Okay. So what that interpretation suggests is that they're forgetting due to the passage of time, right? So that's the decay explanation. But Keppel and Underwood decided to look at the individual trials instead. So when they looked at the very first time participants completed the Brown-Peterson task, there was no significant difference in the percent recalled in the 3-second case and the 18-second case, right? And we only started to see a difference in recall after 3 or 4 iterations. So what that suggests is it wasn't just the passage of time without rehearsal, but it was the proactive interference on later trials, right? So by the third trial, when you're trying to remember the current letters, right, you've got the letters from the previous trials that are still very prominent in your mind and are interfering with your ability to recall the most recent letters. Okay? Okay, so now that we've talked about different components of Broadbent's short-term memory model and capacity and duration and things like that, let's return to the model that most of you all are probably familiar with. So this is the Atkinson and Shiffrin 1968 modal model of short-term memory. And so this model essentially expanded upon Broadbent's model by suggesting that memory is comprised of 3 memory stores and flexible, controllable memory processes that transmit information between the stores, right? So their process model includes 3 different types of memory stores. So we have a sensory register for visual sensory memory and echoic sensory memory. We have a short-term memory store and a long-term memory store. And so sensory memory is modeled after Sperling's 1960 conception of sensory memory. and that it's presumed to be a large capacity, modality specific short-term memory store where information is decayed very rapidly, right? So we have where our senses are bombarded by sensory information in the environment, right? And um, anything that is acquired via our senses, anything that we see, that we touch, that we hear, is going to be temporarily registered in sensory memory, which is a very, very fastly decaying, rapidly forgotten memory store that has an unlimited capacity. So everything that our senses perceive is temporarily registered in sensory memory, but it's rapidly forgotten. And only the information in our sensory registers that we pay attention to is transmitted to short-term memory, okay? And the information in short-term memory has a very limited capacity, as we just talked about 4 units of information, and its duration is about 30 seconds, right? So information that we pay attention to is transferred from sensory memory to short-term memory. And if we want that information to remain in short-term memory beyond about 20 or 30 seconds, we're going to engage in a process known as maintenance rehearsal. Okay, so we're going to say the information over and over again like we would a phone number, right? And that's maintenance rehearsal, saying the information aloud to oneself. And that maintenance rehearsal, according to Atkinson and Schifrin 1968 in their modal model, all we need to do is maintain that information through rehearsal, and then eventually it'll be stored in long-term memory, right? And long-term memory, like sensory memory, has an unlimited capacity and the duration is permanent, okay? And there's a constant flow of information from short-term memory to long-term memory, and also from long-term memory back to short-term memory. So for example, if you're reading a passage in a book, okay, the sentence itself, so the words that you're reading are stored in short-term memory, okay? But your definitions for the words and your understanding of the plot, okay, that comes from long-term memory. So that information is transferred from long-term memory into short-term memory to facilitate comprehension of whatever it is that you're reading, right? So that's the modal model, or the Atkinson and Schifrin 1968 model. It's also referred to as the information processing model because it uses the computer as a metaphor for the mind. And the reason why it's called the modal model is because it contains elements of many different information processing models that were being proposed at the time. So the most frequently cited support for the modal model comes from the observation of serial position curves generated from research from what are called free recall experiments. So in the free recall paradigm, participants are presented with lists of items to learn and are then asked to report items from the list in any order that they like. So what we see with respect to serial position curves is researchers look at how frequently items are recalled from each position in the list. And what they find are essentially 2 effects. So the first effect is the recency effect. And the recency effect is basically the finding that items at the end of the list tend to be recalled better than items in the middle of the list. And so recency effects are caused by the fact that the most recently learned items in the list currently reside in short-term memory, right? So people recall the items at the end of the list first because they currently reside in short-term memory. The second serial position effect that we observe is something called the primacy effect. And the primacy effect is the phenomenon that, like the items at the end of the list, the items at the beginning of the list are also recalled better than items in the middle of the list. So this primacy effect reflects the fact that items at the beginning of the list were rehearsed more often, and therefore they were transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory. So why were the items at the beginning of the list rehearsed more often? Well, there were simply fewer items to rehearse, and so people can rehearse more of those items. So for example, if you're memorizing or if you're rehearsing each item, and the first word is dime, and the second word is coal, and the third word is phone, dime, coal, phone, and then you add the word grace, for example, and then eventually, once you get to about 5 or 6 items, you can no longer rehearse them that quickly, but at least for the first few items, you're going to get a lot of rehearsals in, and so that's going to transfer those items into long-term memory. So primacy effects reflect long-term memory, and recency effects reflect short-term memory. So the modal model makes several strong predictions about the serial position curve. First, the modal model predicts that there will be a primacy effect and a recency effect at all list lengths. So no matter how many items are on your list, you'll always get more rehearsal of the early items in the list, and you'll always have the last few items still available in short-term memory. So regardless of whether the list contains 10, 15, 5, 10, or 15 or 20 items, you're going to get both primacy effects and recency effects. And that's in fact what Murdoch 1972 uh, observed, is that there's clear primacy and recency effects regardless of how many items are on the list. Second, the modal model predicts that participants will first recall items from the end of the list, then items from the beginning, and finally items from the middle. And indeed, Welch and Burnett in 1924 found that items from the list are reported first because those items currently reside in short-term memory, and then the items from the beginning of the list that are still in long-term memory are recalled, and lastly, the items from the middle of the list are recalled. Third, the modal model predicts that items early in the list will be rehearsed more than items later in the list. So Rundis and Atkinson in 1970 tested this hypothesis by instructing participants to rehearse out loud while the items were presented in the free recall task. And they found that items early in the 20-item list were rehearsed about 12 times, whereas items in the middle and at the end of the list were rehearsed 4 or fewer times. So it's true that items in the beginning of the list benefit from about 5 times as many rehearsals as items in the other list positions. Finally, the modal model predicts that delaying the free recall test and having participants do something else will eliminate the recency effect, but not the primacy effect, right? And this is because the recency effect is because those items are still in short-term memory. So if you have participants do something else that's also going to occupy their short-term memory, then those last few items are going to be forgotten. In contrast, the first items on the list have already been transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory. So those effects should be intact regardless of what the participant is doing at the end of the list. So Glanzer and Kunitz in 1966, they show support for this prediction in an experiment in which the recency effect, but not the primacy effect, was eliminated when participants were asked to count backwards, right? Because counting backwards prevented them from rehearsing those last few items in their short-term memory. Although there's a lot of data that supports the modal model, and the modal model makes several correct predictions about performance on free recall tasks, further experimentation calls into question some of the tenets of the model. So the modal model clearly predicts that impeding rehearsal on every trial with a task that occupies short-term memory should affect recall for all of the items. According to the modal model, no items will enter long-term memory without rehearsal, and no items will be available for report from short-term memory because the distraction task and not the items from the list will occupy short-term memory, like I just said, right? However, researchers who have used a continual distraction paradigm in which each list learned for serial recall was preceded and followed by a distracting task, such as verifying arithmetic problems or counting backwards by sevens. Despite those distractions, they have found substantial primacy and recency effects, even when there was a distracting task on every single trial. So that goes against the unique predictions of the modal model, right? Even in the face of distraction, people are still showing recency effects. So why did our earlier example from Glanzer and Kunitz in 1966 show that distraction disrupted recency effects? Well, the proposal that the researchers made is that the specific task demands determine whether recency is affected or not, right? So basically, there are three critiques of the modal model. The first critique is the relationship between rehearsal and memory, right? So the model asserts that items must be rehearsed in order to enter long-term memory, and that short-term memory is occupied by distracting tasks that prevent rehearsal of those items or recall of those items. However, studies show that both primacy and recency effects persist even in the face of distractions, which contradicts the model. And so the recency effect, though traditionally seen as evidence for short-term memory, is more likely influenced by task demands. So specifically, those task demands include the retention interval, or the period of time that has passed between the last word presented on the list and the recall test, and also the inter-item presentation interval. So if we look at the ratio of the inter-presentation interval and the retention interval, those variables seem to affect the recency effect more, suggesting that more variables influence recency effects than just what information currently resides in your short-term memory. There's also the issue of the theory rather of strategic task switching. So the recency effect could also be due to task switching. So for example, if you provide the same kind of distraction, so if, for example, while participants are studying the items in the list, you have them occasionally solve basic math problems. If they have to solve the same type of distractor task, like it's always a math problem, then they'll still show recency effects. But if you switch up the distractor so that sometimes they're drawing something from memory and sometimes they're solving math problems while also trying to remember the words in the list, then they won't show a recency effect, right? So all of this data essentially that critiques the modal model basically says that there's more going on with recency effects than just the information that currently resides in your short-term memory, and there's more going on with primacy effects than just information getting encoded into long-term memory, is in effect what they're saying. So other critiques of the modal model with respect to the primacy effect is the primacy effect may result from continuous rehearsal of the initial items rather than transfer to long-term memory. Right. So essentially what it's saying is primacy effects don't reflect transfer to long-term memory as much as they reflect rehearsal. So experiments have shown that if you allow items from the beginning of the list, items in the middle of the list, and items at the end of the list to be rehearsed the same number of times, then basically that eliminates the primacy advantage. So it's less about transferring the information to long-term memory and more about rehearsal, the number of times the items are rehearsed. So related to that, the modal model suggests that memory stores operate independently, but a lot of more recent evidence shows that there's kind of constant interaction between short-term and long-term memory. And so therefore it makes it much murkier when we try to measure them separately or think about them as distinct processes.